Welcome to Our Community. Susie Thomas with you this morning. We are visiting with Jacob Masters. He is the director of museums for 3 different museums. One of them we're going to be talking about today. That is historic Schönbrunn Village. Good morning, Jacob.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
First of all, what brought you? How long have you been working in this capacity?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I actually started 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago. It'll be 6 in November. I worked with the Ohio History Connection in Columbus as a regional partner and kind of a representative for them in the AmeriCorps program. And my site was the Denison Railroad Depot Museum, which operates Schönbrunn Village. So for 6 years, I've been a part of this organization, almost 6 years.
What interested you in this area?
Oh, goodness. Funny story. So my degree's in mathematics.
Of course.
And I love math. I also love history. Don't really go together sometimes, but, really a lot of my job is really focusing on the financial and the business side of the museum. Although I do some of the history, I do focus more on the business side and events and that kind of stuff. But I knew the director very well. I was actually good friends with her daughter in college, and so she had a job, and I was like, okay, well, I need one. So it just kind of worked out perfectly.
It's great, and it's been a good fit for
you.
Oh,
it has actually been very good. Again, as a math person, I wasn't sure exactly how I would feel in a history location, but I like it a lot. So
it grows on you, doesn't it?
It does. Oh, it does.
I think when you're working with something like of historical significance, you get to know the people.
Oh,
you
totally.
Start to really get to
and
appreciate the story
Yep.
and everything about them. So let's talk about Schönbrunn.
Okay.
What first of all, when we go there to visit, what will we find?
Well, the cool thing about Schönbrunn, and I absolutely love this, when you drive in, it's like a long driveway to get to it. So you pull off of, the main street and you pull off this little driveway. And then as you start going back, it starts, it's all this foliage is around you. So it's like you're literally going to be immersed in the 1770s. So you pull up, you go into the gift shop, there's a video, there's a museum, but then when you look out, and the really cool thing is that all where the gift shop is, it's all glass. So you can look right out into the village. And so when you're looking out into the village, you see the cabins and you see the fence, and it's literally like you are stepping back into the 1770s. It is phenomenal, and it's so cool, and it's so pretty. It's very peaceful too. We always talk about how there are days when the depot is very, very hectic, and then we have Schönbrunn, which is very, very quiet and peaceful and relaxing. So it's like, let's go work at Schönbrunn for a day, because it's so quiet and relaxing.
Does it stay that way when there are lots of families visiting? And
the cool thing about Schönbrunn too is that when we just had a school tour of 250 kids, all of New Philly 3rd grade came, and they're all out in the village, they're all doing activities, and you would never know that they're there because there's so much space. You would never know there's that many people. So even then, it's still pretty quiet.
What would we find there that is the real McCoy? I know there a lot of the cabins have been rebuilt, of course, because it's what? Well, it was
1770 is when they found it. 1772 is when they actually founded the village. They actually left in 1777. The missionaries who were there, and then all of the buildings were torn down. It was actually turned into farmland, and it wasn't until the 1920s that they actually found Schönbrunn and were able to.
Foundations,
they found all the foundation of the buildings, which was very cool because the person who founded it, David Zeisberger, big missionary, one of the biggest missionaries in the Moravian Faith, was the one who founded Schönbrunn, and he was the one who he wrote in a journal, and in his journal he kept such accurate records. That's how we were able to find Schönbrunn. I mean, we know exactly how far his fireplace is from the spring, which is what Schönbrunn's named after. It's beautiful spring in German. So
Schönbrunn is beautiful spring?
Yes.
In German.
In German.
So the buildings that are on the foundations then, you kind of reconstructed them based on his notes from the very, very early days.
And his notes, and also, what would be typical of that time period. They're very crude, they're not fancy, although when you walk into some, you'd be surprised. Some have wooden floors, some have whitewashed walls. I mean, that's a very European style of building a cabin, but they did it.
So when we go to the cemetery, is that the actual cemetery?
That is the real cemetery.
That's the real thing.
Yes, that is the real cemetery.
And who's buried there?
The Moravian people who died in the village, although there's some speculation because, again, we know who's buried there because of David Zeisberger's records. When they actually exhumed the bodies in the 20s to make sure they were actually there. When they were first buried, they were actually just wrapped in ceremonial cloth and just buried. So the remains were all still there, but when they reburied them in the 1920s, they put them in wooden coffins, a little bit nicer. I mean, even though they're dead, it's still, a little bit more respect for the dead. So, but we know exactly who's buried there. So there's some unknowns that we don't know about, and the reason we believe that is because they may have been buried after the village was abandoned, or maybe he didn't write it down. We're not exactly sure, but there are a couple unknowns. But there's over 40 bodies buried in the cemetery, and they're all men, women, children. It's very interesting because you were not buried with mom and dad, or you're not buried with your spouse. You were actually buried by your choir system. And the choir system has nothing to do with singing, but it's based on like the people who were like your friends, the people you hung out with. They were the people who were your age, your gender, and if you were married or not. So they had all these different choir systems, and you were buried the same way that you went to church, that you were in school. So that's how they did it.
How do they know how much space to reserve for a gang of folks that hang out together?
At that point, I don't think they really knew. They didn't know how many people were going to die, but they knew,
exactly.
So, I mean, they just had a plot. And the cool thing about it, too, is that all Moravian mission towns were pretty much the same. The cemetery is at the highest point in the village, which it is at the highest point. It's kind of on a hill. And then all the bodies face east to see the Savior as he rises. And, they didn't believe that you died either. When you did die, they say you went home. You went back to Christ, is what they said.
Many of them, when you look at the memorial stones, they do say went home.
Yep.
on a certain date.
Yep.
Did they undergo any kind of a bad winter, or was there any kind of a blight or an illness that took out a lot of people at once? Or was this just your common, basically, as time progressed, different people died?
It was more of a time progressed. There really wasn't, Ohio, I couldn't imagine what Ohio was like. We have bad winters now. I couldn't imagine what it would have been like in 1770s without fossil fuels and everything else. But, really... there wasn't anything bad. The reason actually David Zeisberger came to find Schönbrunn, one of the main reasons, was that he was actually called by Nedawatwees, which was one of the main Delaware Indian chiefs at the time. And so he was brought to our area, this area, because there was a smallpox epidemic. And as the story goes, when David Zeisberger came, smallpox was eradicated. There's no explanation why. They just, for some reason, they're like, it must have been him, and so they're like, we're going to give you land, and it happened to be Schönbrunn.
Miraculously,
Yep.
He didn't come with medicine from Europe.
No.
Isn't that a neat story?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
love stories like that. Where can people find Schönbrunn Village, historic Schönbrunn Village, right now?
You mean like the location?
Yes.
Yes,
where
sorry.
people are saying, I want to visit this place.
Okay.
How
We
do
are
they
actually
find you?
located at 1984 East High Avenue in New Philadelphia. We're open seasonally. We're open Memorial Day through Labor Day, Tuesday through Friday, 9:30 to 5, and Sundays 12 to 5. And then we actually are open only on weekends in September and October. Now we have lots of events throughout the year as well, so that make it a little more fun. We're open. We do a sunrise service at Easter. We do some events in December. We have a lot of events in October. So,
oh my! All right. Do you know them off the top of your head?
I know every single one.
Okay. We will get back to events, but before we do, I'd like to know more about the Moravian Indians.
Okay. Well, first off, the Moravian Faith. We'll start with that first because you got to know that story.
Okay.
So the Moravian Faith were the first Christians to separate from the Catholic Church 100 years before Martin Luther ever did. They were started with John Huss, in a small part of Germany called Saxony. That was a province of Germany. This is a long, long time ago. This is 1400s. So, but like I said, 100 years before Martin Luther ever separated from the Catholic Church. So when they separated, they started missionaries. And so when they came over to it wasn't the United States at the time, but when they came over, just like the Puritans, just like all the other, they wanted religious freedom. So that's what they were looking for. And so that's what they got. They actually settled in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Those are like the two major hubs of the Moravian Faith. So after that, they started to branch out. And so they wanted to move to the Ohio Valley. That was one of their biggest targets. So, before Ohio ever was a state, before we were ever a country, as I said, the story about David Zeisberger coming, he came, cured the people of smallpox somehow, and then settled at Schönbrunn, and it kind of all went from there. The Moravian people are pacifists. They don't like war. They like to sing a lot, which most Christians like to sing. But it seems to be like I have been to a couple Moravian services, and it is like constant singing. It is like all the time. But the Delaware, most of the Moravian converts were Delaware. They were Delaware Indians. Again, that settled in the Ohio Valley as well. So.
Now, what was it about the Ohio Valley that attracted them? Do you know?
Well, again, the reason. Well, I think the biggest reason was because, it was an area that, of course, this was the Wild West. Ohio was considered the Wild West at one time, and, they had done enough in all the other states. It was time to move on. And so, they had done Pennsylvania. The next one was Ohio. So they just kept moving west. Because, again, like I said, this was the West at the time.
So this was it. They were going west, and this is as far as they got.
Well,
and they felt at home there.
Exactly, they did. And another part of the story goes is that when the exact location of the village that was founded was because they were canoeing up the Tuscarawas River. They found this rushing spring. They followed it to the end. At the top of the hill is where they found Schönbrunn, and that's why Schönbrunn got its name. Beautiful spring.
At this point that they were settling into the Ohio Valley, were they still Delaware Indians, or had they adopted the Moravian faith at that point?
It was a little bit of both. To live at Schönbrunn, you had to be Christian. You had to be Moravian. Although, we hear that rule, and then we hear other rules as well that, there were people that were in the process of converting to, the Moravian faith.
And David Zeisberger was the person who introduced the Moravian faith to the Delaware Indians?
He was.
Okay. I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to let you tell the story, which is Trumpet in the Land, in our second part of the interview. But to close out the first part, let's go back to events. Tell us some of the very cool things that we can see when we visit Schönbrunn Village.
Well, we actually just got done with a lantern tour. It was this last Saturday. If you've never seen the village, you see it during the day. It's totally different at night. We all of the cabins are filled. We light the paths with luminaries. The only light that you have is the light from candlelight. That is it. So you really see what life was like, especially at night in the 1770s. I don't know how they read. I don't know how they write. How are they able to do any of this with like such little amount of light? But they were able to do it. They probably all had bad eyesight by the end. But, and we also do Children's Day in June. It's a really fun event where we, have all these different activities for kids. We're in the process of, they build their own cabin out of like those little pool noodles. We actually cut slats and things in them, so you can actually build your own cabin out of pool noodles. I mean, obviously you won't be able to live in it, but one wind and there it goes. But the kids are able to dip their own candles. They're able to make their own Moravian stars. All of these things. So it's a very, very cool event. And then we also have another lantern tour in the autumn in September. It's the third Saturday in September. Again, just like the one in the spring. However, with the crisp autumn air, it is just phenomenal. It's beautiful outside, and the weather is always, knock on wood, is always perfect. And it's just great. Again, seeing the village at night lit up like that is just, it's beautiful. It's magical. And then we also do a trade fair in October. It's the third Saturday in October. And the trade fair is where we literally bring over 200 reenactors. They fill the cabins. They sell their wares. I mean, it is literally like you're walking back in 1772. Oh, wow. You have the village, and then you have all these people, and then everything is period appropriate. The cloth that they use for their tents, the shoes that they wear, the socks that they wear, everything, down to the last detail, is perfect. So, I mean, it is so cool to see that. And, we also have some food vendors and things like that as well that are period appropriate. We have some that are not, but we also have some that are period appropriate inside the village that it's great.
So that is October when? Because that sounds like an amazing thing.
It's the third Saturday in October. I think this year it's the 21st and 22nd.
All right.
So, and then the last event we do for the full year is we do Sleepy Hollow, which is on the lower level of Schönbrunn. So we reenact the famous story by Washington Irving. We have a headless horseman and Ichabod Crane. You get to meet all the characters, and it's by the glow of a bonfire. So you get to see the headless horseman run by and throw the pumpkin and everything. It's awesome.
I know you try to keep everything authentic to the 1700s,
Yep.
but is there a website where we can find information
Yes,
about
there
Schonbrunn?
is. It's just SchonbrunnVillage.org, and then we also have a Facebook page. You can check us out on Facebook as well.
Awesome.
So.
We're visiting with Jacob Masters. He's from historic Schonbrunn Village, and many other museums as well. We're going to be talking to Jacob a lot this week. But for now, let's take a short break and listen to these words. You're listening to Our Community.